Welcome to TCT Alive. My name is Pastor David Longobardo of World Vision International Christian Center in Greensboro, North Carolina, and we're in the beautiful studios of Channel 61 for a great broadcast today. Thank you for joining us. I want you to stay tuned because every Christian is concerned about biblical prophecy. And in addition to biblical prophecy, every Christian is concerned about what's happening in our world today. I'm going to be interviewing today Joel Richardson. Joel Richardson is an outstanding author, lecturer, and human rights activist. He's written a very challenging book. It's called The Islamic AntiChrist, and you're going to be fascinated with this. You're going to be fascinated with it for several reasons. Number one, not only because of his comparisons with biblical prophecy, but his heart and his desire to reach and touch the Muslim community. Let me read you an excerpt, and I want you to listen to this. It says, on September 17th, 2005, the newly elected president of Iran, Ahmadinejad, addressed the United Nations National Assembly in New York City. Concluding his speech, Ahmadinejad opened prayer and pledged to Allah to speedily bring forth the emergence of the mysterious Islamic Messiah figure known as the Mahdi. Journalists and scholars scrambled to understand exactly what he meant. Well, we're going to explore today a comparison between the writings in Islam as it predicts a Messiah, as it predicts their ultimate spiritual and religious leader, and as it relates to biblical prophecy. And so stay tuned, you're going to enjoy it. We're going to have some special music as well throughout the broadcast. Welcome with me right now, Joel. Good to have you. God bless you.
Pastor
Thank you
David,
for being with us.
Thanks for having me on.
Joel, first, before we get into your book and the challenging truths that you present, tell us a little bit about Joel's spiritual journey. The kind of family you grew up in, where you grew up, what your religious or spiritual background was, and how you came to Christ.
Sure. Well, I grew up in South Boston, South Shore, Massachusetts, and we were nominally Catholic. We used to go to church probably once a month. My folks got divorced when I was about 11, so we really kind of stopped going around then. And I lived pretty much as a hedonist for the next several years. And when I was 19, a friend of mine, we've been friends since we were 5 years old, we drove down to Tennessee and Arkansas. He was looking for some cheap land to buy. At the time, back then, you could buy an acre for about $1,000. So I left my mother a note. I said, Mom, I went with Eric. We're going to go buy a mountain. Be back in a week. And but along the way, he also wanted to stop and visit. There was a particular Southern holiness preacher that was having a tent revival meeting. He wanted to stop and visit the tent revival meeting, and I didn't really have any understanding of that. But when we pulled up in the suburb of Memphis, 1 block over from Elvis Presley Boulevard, behind this old Piggly Wiggly in a big field was this tent revival meeting. It was in the middle of August. And I decided, because I was so hot and sweaty, that I would get baptized. And so we went in, and my friend was interested in hearing the preacher. I was just sort of along for the ride. But I got baptized, and I stayed for the meeting. And there were many things that happened that night. There were healings. There were claimed healings. There were healings that I was convinced were legitimate. But probably most powerful was the preaching of the pastor, the minister. And I remember he read from the sermon of John the Baptist, and he said, "The axe at the root of the tree has already been laid, therefore bear fruit in keeping with repentance. And lest that which does not bear fruit will be cast into the fire." And the Holy Spirit came on me powerfully in conviction, and at age 19 I gave my life to Christ that night. And it was an interesting journey walking that out. But in the months that followed, I started attending an Assembly of God church, and we had a missionary that came from Kazakhstan He was working with the Muslims there in the 1040 window, the most unreached area of the world with the gospel. And I decided at that age that I wanted to be someone that was reaching out to Muslims. I felt called to the Islamic world, and I never did make it to that part of the world, at least not long term. But ever since then, my heart has been for the Muslim people, the most populous, unreached people group in the world, are those that don't know Christ, yet they are God seekers. And I've fallen in love with Muslims, and it's really been my passion ever since.
Joe, before the broadcast, you and I were chatting, and you shared with me your evangelistic fervor shortly after being saved, and how that you would go out into the streets of Boston sharing your faith. And you made an interesting kind of comparison between your interaction with Christians and then the interaction that you often had with non-believers, and then the interaction you often had with Muslims. Give us a capsule of that real quickly.
Sure. Well, after coming to faith, most of my hedonist friends didn't want to spend time with me, so feeling as though I was the only believer in the South Shore of Massachusetts, I used to go take the train into Boston, walk around, share my faith. And what I found was that most Westerners, they don't like to talk about God, they don't like to talk about Jesus or the Bible, and if you try to talk to them about those things, the walls go up immediately, and you'll be marginalized as a religious kook. Then I discovered the Jehovah's Witnesses, and they'll talk to you a little bit until they find out that you don't want to become a Jehovah's Witness. But then I discovered Muslims. And what I found with Muslims, and this is one of the reasons that I fell in love with Muslims, is that Muslims love to talk about God, the Bible, Jesus, spiritual things, politics and religion, those subjects that are off limits to the Western mind. And they will sit there and talk with you and engage and argue and shake their fists at you for hours. And then at the end of the day, they'll say, okay, my friend, we'll do it again tomorrow. And so it was for that reason that I said, I love these people. They are, in fact, most often God seekers. And that was also a significant element in cementing my heart and my call to the Muslim peoples.
Prior to that, had you been exposed much in any way to the Muslim community or to the Quran or to their beliefs?
Not really, no. At age 19, this was all very new to me.
So that is really what whet your appetite in terms of your study, not only of the scriptures, but of Islam as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And, within the next few years, I was going to Bible school. And what I felt, this was actually after the first year of Bible school, I decided that since my heart was for the Middle East, rather than studying it, rather than reading about it, I actually up and went ahead and moved to the Middle East for lesser part of a year and just plunged my heart into this thing and sort of on a prayer journey, backpacking around as a young guy and just saying, Lord, teach me about this thing called the Middle East. And again, it was more sitting down, drinking tea, talking politics and religion with Muslims and Jews, and just had a wonderful time.
I read an excerpt from your book, on the back of your book, The Islamic AntiChrist. I read an excerpt that had to do with the prayer that Ahmadinejad prayed at the United Nations and how it sent journalists scrambling to try to understand this Messiah figure that he was petitioning Allah for. As you had your experience in the Middle East, and as your awareness of Islam and the Muslim community grew, out of that has come books like this and comparisons that you are now doing between biblical prophecy and the Islamic focus in terms of their future with respect to their expected Messiah and to the outcomes that they believe in. Address how you began to see these comparisons and how this began, the awareness of it began to grow, because you come to some conclusions in your book that on the one hand are very challenging to many who have already very fixed views as to where the Antichrist will evolve from in biblical history, and you have a very interesting slant on that. And so how did your studies bring you to this?
Sure. Well, let me just start out by saying this. In a nutshell, what I am arguing for and articulating is what I call the Islamic end-time paradigm, or the Islamic end-time theory, which is to say that the Antichrist, his religion, and his empire will come out of the Middle East. Now, the popular paradigm in many prophecy circles in the past 30, 40 years has been the Antichrist, his empire, and his religion will come out of Europe,
Sure.
oftentimes specifically Italy, the Vatican.
Yes.
And a lot of people say, well, what you're teaching is very unique or different. The fact of the matter is that when we look at the writings of the earliest church writings, they all viewed the Antichrist as coming out of the Middle East. So it's old things new again. All I'm trying to do is recover the early church first century belief about the end times. But what happened with me is shortly after 9/11, I was volunteering for various missionary organizations online doing email correspondence. So as various individuals sent emails asking questions, I would help answer them in an intelligent, Christian, and loving way. What we saw during those days was, rather than getting emails from Muslims, we were getting emails from Americans who were interested in Islam. And what we saw during those days shocked all of us. We saw an alarming increase of Americans converting to Islam, many of them claiming to be Christians. Mm-hmm. So it was during those days that I began to discern that Islam was more than just another in a series of false world religions, that there was a powerful, seductive, dark, and demonic force at work in the Islamic religion. And it was also during that time that I began studying what Muslims believe about the end of the age. What is their end time views? And what I saw is that what they believe is what I call to be an exact anti-parallel of the biblical story. It's the same story flipped on its head. They've taken all of the, if you will, the good guys of the biblical story, they've turned them into the bad guys. They've taken the bad guys of the biblical story and they've turned them into their Messiah figures, the good guys. And so that was really where the journey began. I literally purchased every book that I could find in the earth on the subject in English, written by Muslim scholars, whether popular works or orthodox works, anything I could find. I read every one. I took that material and I turned it into this book so that I could help the church and the world understand what Muslims are expecting with regard to the days to come.
Joe, the average Christian has had their awareness of Islam and the beliefs of the Muslim community heightened ever since 9/11 occurred. And yet there is still very widespread ignorance in the Christian community as it relates to the beliefs in Islam and the practices of Islam. Most Christians are aware that the Quran is at the heart and core of the faith of the average Muslim. What they're not aware of are the writings in the Sunnah and other companion readings and prophetic writings that are just as important to the average Muslim as, say, the Quran is to them. In your study of the Sunnah, basically the beliefs, the practices, the history of Muhammad himself, many of these prophecies that you refer to in your book come out of the writings of the Sunnah. Give us an understanding of what you have discovered as it relates to Islamic prophecies and their comparisons with what you know to be biblical prophecies.
Sure. Yeah, well, exactly as you said, Muslims, their faith is based not only on the Quran, but also the extra Quranic writings called the Sunnah or the Hadith, as well as their history, the Sirat literature, and so forth. These things hold an equal weight of authority. So a lot of times, this is important for Christians to understand. A Christian will bring up something about Islam, and the Muslim will say, "Where's that in the Quran? That's not in the Quran." Well, that's a smokescreen, because he knows very well that they have extra Quranic material that is equally authoritative to them in their faith.